Kitty Clash, and today I wanted to go ahead and talk about some stuff that I think is really important. Let me adjust my volume settings really quickly. I think I turned the game audio way down at one point because it was overpowering other players post-update, but I wanted to come back to the basement of Sunny Meadows and talk talk more about seclusion rooms, because this is a representation of a seclusion room. This is something that is still being used on disabled people to this day. It's honestly not a happy sight, and yet I still think that this is accurate representation. This is accurate representation in a video game, and something that I love is that this manages very accurately to capture the hopelessness of actual seclusion rooms, because I don't really like talking about this, but this is something that it's like I feel like if I'm not talking about this, then who is going to talk about this? And so it needs to be me talking about this. Also, let me go change my sound setting here. This is okay. That's already at 100%. But yeah, I wanted to talk about seclusion rooms and Sunny Meadows because I think this is an accurate representation of what seclusion rooms are like. It captures the feeling of you don't know when it's going to end, because the reality is that I am in my 20s now, so this was quite a while ago in my life, thankfully, and it's something that in a lot of ways, with time and with talking about it, I've become better able to live a life beyond that, despite the traumas. And that's something that it's like I do kind of, I would say, have a barrier in my mind between now and then. I try to separate myself from that, but the reality is that I was it's like I was put in seclusion rooms for many hours of my life, and this did happen in public schools, but it also happened specifically at a school that was catering towards special needs kids, and I think that's something that I need to be the one talking about, instead of like, I can't just wait for the media to tell stories of kids like me, because what happened to me as a kid is still happening to a lot of kids to this day. And the thing is that when it's happening to kids in special needs schools, a lot of us people who are different, we have trouble communicating what's going on and what's happening to us, because in a special needs school you don't have the amount of like neurotypical kids being there saying, hey, something's wrong, and advocating and telling parents if something is going wrong. A lot of us on the spectrum, either like, we tend to struggle sometimes with communication. There are some people on the spectrum who would be considered like nonverbal and who may not always communicate through verbal means. I'm someone who, it's like, yes, I can talk, but I felt very ashamed of like what was going on and happening to me, so I didn't like talking about what was happening to me. And so yeah, but I was locked in carpeted rooms for many hours of my life. It was like a room honestly, it was about this size. I was a little bit shorter then than I am now, so, but it was a room kind of like the size of a walk-in closet is how I would describe it, and it had carpets on the walls, and I remember it had a dusty smell. It had an ever-present dust smell to it, and the floor was like a carpet too, but it wasn't like the padded carpet that the walls were. And I remember the lights being just too bright, and it wasn't a padded door. It was a wooden door that locked with a deadbolt from the outside, and it had a little window, so theoretically a teacher would be watching from the outside. But the reality is that there aren't always enough staff members to make sure that everything's going smoothly, etc., etc. And so even though theoretically there was always supposed to be someone outside the door, if, for instance, there was like ever to be a fire someday, I have no clue if the kids in the seclusion rooms would actually get out alive. And I love how Sunny Meadows does accurately, represent the fact that it's like, hey, um, not everyone has good experiences with the people and the places that are supposedly meant to help the disabled, the neurodiverse, people who in the past would have been called mentally ill. Um, because yes, seclusion rooms are supposed to be this thing that kids who are having like fits of violence or whatever are put in until they're able to calm down, but that isn't how, in my experience, that is not how they were actually used. It was a place where someone, if you talked back or like were refusing to do something but you doing it being very peaceful, just non-violent resistance, like I would still get locked in these rooms in those circumstances as well, where when I wasn't any danger to anybody. It was a place where I spent a lot of time. It's like, oh, I was having trouble understanding a math problem, so I'd refuse to do the math problem. It's like, okay, then I'd get dragged out and put in this room and locked there. And it's something that it's like, I I love Phasmophobia for representing this, because it's a it's cheaper than therapy is how I would put it. It's like, okay, I feel because it's triggering a lot of memories in me, it's like I'm able to talk through things that were very painful for me, that are very painful for me to talk about. And so I wanted to to just talk about this because I feel like it gets my mouth like flowing, it gets my words flowing, it gets my brain flowing, and helping to process a lot of like unresolved trauma that I have in my life from like really negative experiences. And it's like, I think that Sunny Meadows does capture the fact that it's like, hey, Sunny Meadows is meant to represent like a mental institution, a sanatorium, and sanatoriums were supposed to be places where people who had mental health issues could go to recover. The goal was supposed to be to help people, but the reality is that it didn't. A lot of times sanatoriums and mental institutions had abuse going on at them. And in the same way, special needs schools catering to kids with disabilities, like they're supposed to be there to help people who have struggles, people who might not necessarily be able to succeed in a traditional classroom setting. But in real life, they do sometimes end up covering up abuse. They do oftentimes have things like not just seclusion, but also physical restraint, being held / pinned to the floor in like sometimes for prolonged periods of times while not struggling. They were also like yeah, it's kind of, it's one of those things where it is hard for me to talk about this, and this kind of is like, I guess I would describe it, what's the word I'm looking for, like processing through processing my trauma. So it is kind of like info dumping, I guess. I'm just letting my consciousness like flow, letting the words flow. Um, but yeah, I remember that there were times when I would refuse to drink water because I knew that I wouldn't have access to the bathroom for like multiple hours at a time. And so I know that that actually was not good for my health, because there was one point in my life where I was on a medication that I was supposed to drink a ton of water with. And so that is something that I um how do I put this? It's one of those things where it's like, yeah, the special needs schools, yeah, these are supposed to be to help kids with disabilities, but in some ways it's like they are not taking into account things like the medical needs of kids with disabilities or the human rights of kids with disabilities. Like having access to a toilet is something that I think is like really fundamental to being a human, because everyone like has to go to the bathroom, and if you're not letting kids out of seclusion rooms to go to the bathroom, then you put them in a position where they either have to stop eating and stop drinking, or else they're going to end up like having an accident, which is something that is, I would say, extraordinarily humiliating, and I think dehumanizing to people with disabilities who already, I think, are treated in some ways as less than equal. Yeah, sorry, I guess I am just rambling here, but I do just want to talk about this because this is something that is I think helpful for me to talk about, and also helpful in that it's raising awareness of like a lot of the issues that disabled kids in America still face even to this day. Because if this was happening in like would have been like, I'm gonna say like 2007 time frame. Okay, I'm trying to remember. Math is one of those things that it's like my brain is having, like, how do I put this? I'm in a lot of emotional like distress right now and pain, so it's like my brain is having trouble with math. But just think the second half of the 2000s, like 2005 to 2010 time frame is when this was happening to me. But it's still, there are a lot of places where seclusion rooms are still legal in the US and still used. And so I think it's important that the people who are adults today that went through these as children speak up about them, because I don't think it's reasonable to expect a 7-year-old to advocate for themselves. I don't think it's reasonable to expect like a 12-year-old who has major issues communicating to be able to advocate for themselves. So I think it's up to people like me who were mistreated as children to be the ones speaking up and saying, hey, this is what's happening. This is something that's still happening. So that way we can raise awareness and make the world a better place for the kids who are disabled today. I would say like the special needs school is where the majority of the bad things were happening. But the public school, like I was put in seclusion rooms there, but they weren't as ingrained in that setting. Like they didn't, like it was kind of like the public school that I went to in part of second grade and sorry, I think it was like all of second grade and part of third grade. They did, I don't think I was put in them very much in second grade, but if I remember right, I had a teacher who actually had a disabled child, and so I wonder if part of the reason I was like better treated at that year had to do with the fact that I actually had a teacher who in some ways understood what being a kid with disabilities was like, what having a kid with disabilities was like, and the greater the differences and the greater needs of us with disabilities. Sorry, there's a lot of background sound here. I did specifically turn off the I think it's sanity drain, and I think I turned on friendly ghost mode, so we shouldn't be getting any hunts or anything, and we should be getting probably not a lot of ghost events with the sanity this high. But I really thought like this is such a good representation of what I've been through that I in a weird way I love this room in the game. Yeah, and yeah, I would say like in third grade the teacher was a lot less understanding, and so I did get put in a room that wasn't quite like this. It was more of just like a walk-in closet sized room, but without the padding on the walls. Oh, sorry, I need to shake the glow stick. And that one, I remember specifically, like one time that I think we were supposed to go on a field trip to a theater, and I did something, I don't even remember what at this point, but for some reason I got put in the room and like wasn't allowed to go on the field trip with the other classmates, which is kind of sad to think about, that it's like, hey, in America we are supposed to have things like the IDEA, it's I can't remember what it actually stands for, but it's an like a federal law, I think, that's supposed to be like, hey, protecting in a lot of ways, like the rights of disabled kids to be taught in like the same setting as like neurotypical and non-disabled kids, as long as like they're able to, as long as I'm trying to remember what the exact wording is, but it is supposed to be that if you are able to be educated in the same setting as like neurotypical and like able-bodied people, that disabled kids have the right to be so. But even though it's like we do have these laws and protections in America, oftentimes disabled kids don't actually have them in practice, because if you don't have like a lawyer willing to advocate for you to take on school districts, it's like you can't necessarily always enforce make sure that the law is actually being followed. And there's also the issue of disabled kids can't always advocate for themselves, for ourselves. I know that I'm technically an adult now, so I don't really qualify as kid anymore, but I was a kid when a lot of bad stuff was happening to me. The the thing is, kids can't always advocate for themselves, and so they might not even be telling their parents if they're being put in seclusion rooms, or if for instance, if they have an IEP set up, they might not always, you need to make sure that your kid knows, if you have a disabled kid, that your kid knows what they're entitled to in their IEP, what you have set up, so that way they can actually tell you if it's being not upheld, if their IEP is being violated. The kids actually need to be told what's been set up, what's been in place. That way they can communicate with their parents about what's happening. Yeah. But I do know that there were times where it's okay, other kids were had gotta do things like go on field trips, where it's hey, I was not allowed to go on the field trip, and it's really screwed up that it's hey, the little disabled girl, the little autistic girl, was not allowed to go on the field trip to the theater. And come to find out, that theater actually is really freaking amazing at dealing with kids with disabilities. I don't really want to segue into that yet, but I know that towards the end of third grade, I was essentially not able to go to the public school in our area anymore, which is when I got put in the special needs school from the last couple of months of third grade, and then fourth grade, fifth grade, and part of sixth grade. Which at that point, my parents eventually realized that the situation was really bad, and they ended up withdrawing me from the public schools to homeschool me, which ended up, for my particular situation, being a good fit. But the reality is, different people have different situations, and I'm not advocating for some one-size-fits-all thing. I'm simply saying that the education resources in my area were just absolutely not able. The public schools weren't able to handle my needs. The special needs school in the area was just locking me in seclusion rooms all day, because by the end of sixth grade, pretty much all the time was spent either in a seclusion room or at a separate hall, this desk in the hallway that was kind of it had I think a divider or something. How do I describe it? In front of it, where I wasn't allowed to be in class with the other 4 or 5 kids in my what would have been considered my class. But I think it's interesting because I think, how would I describe it? I think that the school did some things that I would consider to be as an adult, I would consider them to be forms of humiliation. They were specifically trying to humiliate us by specifically excluding us, segregating us from other members of the class and stuff. And it's I don't know. There were also things that were just, to me as an adult, stand out as really weird. They wouldn't ever if so in the bathrooms there were 2 or 3 stalls, but if there was one single person in any of the stalls in the bathroom, you weren't allowed to go into the bathroom, so you'd have to wait outside of the bathroom, and you always had to knock before entering. But it wasn't how do I put this? It was a bathroom that had individual stalls in it, but you had to walk before entering the main bathroom itself with the sinks and stuff. And it was just really, I never understood that, and it just seemed like a backwards rule to me. And it's I followed it, but it was a really backwards rule that I don't understand. And it's one of those things where I'm neurotypical people would never be expected to behave in that way, so I'm wondering why they thought it was okay to and also the thing that didn't make sense to me is the teachers didn't have to follow that rule. If there was a student in one of the bathrooms, the teacher could go in and use a different stall, but the student couldn't. So to me, it was always weird double standards, and as someone on the autism spectrum, it's hey, I notice when things don't make sense, so I wanted to that's one of those things where it's I think people need to know that weird stuff like this was going on, because oftentimes disabled people are subjected to weird rules that don't make frickin' sense, and then what's the word, like neurotypical people will say, oh, follow this rule, but then not explain it, and then the autistic people are like, what does this even mean? Why are you expecting us to follow that? And then rightly being like, hey, this doesn't make sense. And so, like, I think a lot of us on the spectrum, like, we tend to take things a little bit, like, literally, like, we want to know why something is the way that it is. And so having completely rubbish rules that don't make sense is something that I think, like, stands out to us and makes us go, like, what is this? What is this? Why are we expected to behave this way? And so I think that's something where it's like, we might question that and act up because we're like, this doesn't make logical sense, so we're not going to follow this, and get punished for that in ways that it's like, I kind of wonder, is it a situation where a neurotypical person would actually follow the rule, or would they also be like, hey, this seems weird, but who knows? Yeah. I'm trying to think of other things that it's like, it's like, do I want to get any more off my chest today, or do I just want to, like, say I've talked about a lot of things that were bothering me, and so I feel like a weight has been lifted off of my shoulders in a lot of ways. Yeah, I do feel like a weight has been lifted off my shoulders just talking about this. So yeah, I think that actually, like, that is almost enough. I say almost enough for today. I feel like this was cheaper than therapy. Oh my gosh, I am totally lost right now. Yeah, I do like the... Oh, why is this locked? Okay. I do like how Sunny Meadows, it doesn't sugarcoat the fact that mental institutions, at least in the United States, have not always been very helpful places. And that, you know, disabled people aren't always treated very well in the world. And again, I do like how it shows / really does represent the fact that, like, hey, seclusion rooms essentially were evolved from asylums, and doesn't it strike you as a bit disconcerting that there are rooms like these in public schools for elementary age children? Like, why do we as a society accept that? I guess that there obviously are people who just aren't even aware, like, don't even realize or know about these, which is understandable. But I think it's one of those things that once people know about and are aware of the fact that, hey, there are oftentimes, like, rooms that lock from the outside that kids are just thrown in for extended hours at a time, that this isn't necessarily okay, and that just because something happens doesn't mean that it's okay. We need to raise awareness of these issues and talk about them. So yeah, I feel like I've managed to be a fairly happy person in my life, despite the fact that it's like, yeah, I've gone through a lot of things that I think people shouldn't ever have to go through. I think I'm gonna go ahead and just head back upstairs for right now. Oh, I don't necessarily like the sound effects on this map because they are very scary. If I remember, what I want to see is, like, do they have the full, where is the full text version of this? Because it's somewhere, but I can't remember where it actually is on the map. And I don't really want to go wandering around looking for it, but I do want to talk about, like, the rules for patients being different from the rules for, rules for admission. Sorry, reasons for admission. That's interesting. I thought it said, like, rules for nurses. Danger signals. But I did want to talk about, like, how the rules for patients versus rules for nurses, like, it is reflective of the way that, like, the school that mostly catered to special needs kids, that the rules for what was expected of teachers was definitely different than what was expected of kids, and that sometimes it was confusing. Like, why are we being held to double standards? Was rather, I think it is definitely an inequity in the world. And I want to talk about, I really love the danger signal sign on Phasmophobia. Oh, the ghost is definitely nearby because I hear the doors opening. but danger signals. I like it because it shows that a lot of times, like, perfectly normal neurodiverse things that neurodiverse people do are sometimes, like, demonized in society. Like, I try, but I can't sit still. Like, things like stimming, which are, like, involuntary movements that a lot of times autistic people do to comfort ourselves, like pacing or, like, arm flapping. Like, these are perfectly normal things that a lot of autistic people do, and yet sometimes they are demonized by society. Twitching and fidgeting, again, like, that's something that a lot of us do. Like, it can be a form of stimming. Constant making faces, and some of us on the spectrum, like, we do sometimes have exaggerated facial expressions, or sometimes we may have less exaggerated facial expressions. Like, neurodiverse people oftentimes, like, we may do facial expressions, like, slightly different than neurotypical people do. So I think it's interesting that, again, this is being considered a danger signal, because I think it does show the way that oftentimes disabled people are demonized in society. Stammering and improper breathing. So that okay, biting fingernails, and, like, biting fingernails, I think, is something that's not necessarily a healthy habit. And, like, that's one of those things, though, that it's like, if you provide someone with proper stim toys, like things that are specifically meant to help them with stimming, then you can redirect things like biting fingernails into a healthier habit, something that isn't hurting, like, anyone. Walking aimlessly, again, I pace sometimes, especially, like, if I'm very nervous. Like, I remember when I was younger, like, before an audition, like, I'd get very nervous. Or, like, before phone calls, I could sometimes, like, pace. Making sounds, and again, making sounds, that can be something that some people with disabilities do involuntarily, and it isn't a bad thing. Overly loud actions. Yeah, how do I put this? I guess I walk loudly. And sometimes, like, I tend to accidentally run into things a lot. Aggression to others. That's something that's sad, but I think that, like, honestly, I do want to raise awareness of the fact that sometimes if people feel like they're backed into a corner and they aren't being heard, like, they might, like, how do I put this? If you don't have, like, a normal way of communicating, or a way, not normal, that isn't the word I'm looking for, but if you don't have a way of communicating that's understood, like, someone can, let me try and phrase this better. Those of us on the spectrum, we can end up getting things like sensory overload, which can make it so that we can have, like, meltdowns. But if we're able to communicate, hey, this is what's happening, and ask for accommodations, like, that can oftentimes be, like, headed off. Like, if there's a lot of loud sounds, it's like, if someone's able to say, hey, can you please turn that sound down, then that's something that can be addressed. But if someone is, like, nonverbal or has a lot of trust issues and is having trouble communicating for themselves, or advocating for themselves to other people, then they might not necessarily be able to say, hey, this is what's bothering me, can you please change this? And so someone who has gotten pushed to the point of having, like, full-blown sensory overload, to the point of, like, meltdown, which I think tends, like, I feel like that's something that tends to, how do I put this? Like, I feel like that's something that there are a lot of negative stereotypes around. But yeah, like, aggression to others is something that I don't think is typically, like, meant to hurt anyone. I think it's something that is more so something that can occasionally happen if someone's gotten pushed to the point where their needs were not being met, to the point where they've been triggered into a, like, sensory overload or something, and they can't necessarily, like, it's not voluntary at that point. Like, it isn't, like, out of, like, if someone's, like, throwing a chair or something, that's not because they're trying to hurt someone. I would say it's because someone's been backed into a corner and has, like, it been pushed into flight or fight mode, and that's a point of not, like, not typically not having control at that point. And that would be the time that it's like, okay, seclusion rooms supposedly are for, but the thing is, if they were only used for that, that would be different, but they're not. They are severely overused, and kids who, it's like, if you just tried to accommodate their needs and were better at communicating with neurodiverse children, then you wouldn't have to put them in there to begin with. Rocking is, again, a form of stimming, and other nervous other nervous mannerisms are mental danger signals. But yeah, those are just completely, most of these at least, are completely normal things that happen a lot of times. Not neurodiverse people and those of us on the spectrum, like a lot of us, like we stim and stuff, and so a lot of these could be just normal autism things that are being demonized, being thought of as bad, being like in the school system today, a lot of things that are just like normal like autism things or even ADHD things, or attention related, like is it ADHD or ADD? I forget how that got changed over, because I thought they used to be categorized slightly differently under the DSM-4 than the DSM-5. I can't remember. But I know that a lot of people like with like ADHD or ADD, like sometimes they might do things that are considered like distracting or being a distraction, when it's like that's not something that they're not trying to distract people. That's just them doing like doing things in a way that works for them. It's just normal neurodiversity. And I'm not a mental health professional, but I am someone on the autism spectrum who has a lot of like experience being a neurodiverse human being, and who has also interacted with a lot of other neurodiverse human beings, and see the doctor for special treatment. And that's something that I do appreciate this thing, see the doctor for special treatment there, because the reality is, I think it ties in a lot to the way that neurodiverse people are still to this day treated by society. I remember like even when I was a kid, like there was a lot of people advocating for like, oh, let's research a cure for autism, when it's like, why are we even trying to cure this? This is just a normal way that some people are different. Like I don't want a cure for my brain thinking differently. Yeah, there are a lot of things ways that my life is more difficult, but a lot of the time it's due to the way that neurotypical society treats people like me, lack of consideration for things like sensory issues, and different communication methods. Like there's nothing inherently wrong with me for being neurodiverse. It's just the way that society treats neurodiverse people. And so I think it's sadly accurate to see people, like to see on the sign saying like all these things that are just normal neurodiverse things. It's like they're saying, see the doctor for special treatment. Like it shows the frustrating way that oftentimes like society wants disabled and neurodiverse people to be cured, when it's like there's nothing inherently wrong with us, and sometimes the cures are terrible, awful, atrocious things. Like I'm afraid of getting jump scared, but I'm gonna go back down to this basement. Oh my gosh, I accidentally am going the wrong way. Which way is it? Oh, it's so dark here. Okay, I went that way before. I want to go in this way. This is the terrifying wing. Okay. Like, let me... Oh, I don't want that room. What's the one that... Like this, I think that the surgical tools may very well be a reference to lobotomies, which were something that unfortunately I feel like it doesn't get talked about enough, but were something that was used to attempt to treat, quote unquote, people who had like neurodiversity and or and I guess I kind of do sometimes have mixed feelings about calling like neurodiversity like disability, because I feel like the term disability is sometimes still stigmatized. But the unfortunate thing is that in less than a century ago, a lot of people who were considered mentally ill were lobotomized, and it's really screwed up that happened, but that is something that happened. There were doctors who tried to quote unquote treat people, but ended up the treatment was worse than the actual situation that the disabled people were going through. For that, I guess what's an example, one of the, I can't remember if her name was Rosemary or something, one of the one of the Kennedys was actually lobotomized, and it's like that's one of the only times that I hear that being talked about is because it happened to someone who was rather famous. But the reality is that this happened to many people. And then there are also things like in the United States, forced sterilizations are something that was actually pretty frickin' rampant. I do think that there is more awareness being spread about those because as I think society becomes more aware of some of the atrocities that happened to Native Americans in the United States were also at times subjected to forced sterilization. And so because there is light coming to that, I think it's also leading to people doing more research into the way that disabled people were forcibly sterilized in mental institutions. And if you want to learn more about that, I think a starting place would be to look into Buck v. Bell, the Supreme Court decision, to understand just the horrifying atrocity of the fact that this was considered legal in the United States, throughout a lot of the 20th century. And it's horrifying to realize that, in a lot of ways, disabled people's, aren't... we don't always have our human rights respected. We are sometimes dehumanized or treated as if we're sometimes treated as if we don't have human rights. And I guess an example of that to this day would be something like Britney Spears. Didn't she? I thought wasn't she essentially forced to be on some sort of birth control against her will, which again I think that is unfortunately a modern day iteration or a continuation of the atrocity of Buck v. Bell, that it's this at this point 100-year-old Supreme Court decision still has implications in the 21st century and it can still apply to people to this day, which is really screwed up, really horrifying to realize. But I feel like people need to be raising awareness of the way that disabled people have been treated really awfully throughout the 20th century especially, but still to this day. And oddly enough, okay, I'm gonna go to the chapel in here. I hope I don't get jump scared. But something that I think is interesting here is that this was, there's this implication that Sunny Meadows theoretically might, okay, how do I put this? There are implications that, hey, this could have been a religious institution, etc., with the chapel. But I also, if I remember correctly, a lot of older big buildings, like grand estates, even had churches in them. Because if I'm remembering correctly, in Mansfield Park, I think, didn't the Rushworths have, a church inside their actual house? So bigger buildings that are meant to serve a lot of people having a chapel in it, that could just be de facto, normal, a cultural thing, rather than it being specifically a religious institution. That I don't think it's interesting that it's it's, yeah, it has a lot of religious iconography, but I wanted to talk about something that I think is really weird, which is, oddly enough, the Satanic Temple of all places, which is, something that I think in America, I think a lot of Americans tend to be a little bit skittish about anything with the word Satan in the name, but the Satanic Temple, I think, did a lot, they had some weird, I can't remember what it's called, but they had some project where they were trying to raise awareness of corporal punishment in schools, seclusion and restraint in schools, and the denial of access to bathrooms in schools. And I think it's really is something that it's worth noting that the Satanic Temple is actually doing a lot to address the way that disabled people are oftentimes treated badly in public institutions like public schools. And I think it's interesting as a contrast to say, hey, the Satanic Temple's actually raising awareness of this when sometimes traditional religious institutions or other religious institutions haven't always had the best track record of actually advocating against things like the mistreatment of disabled people. And indeed, there have been examples of religious-based institutions, in some cases, not treating people very well at all. And potentially making things worse for certain people's lives. So I think it's interesting to see, like, the chapel here in a place that really has the markings of a lot of, like, torture and suffering. Not in the same place where unwanted surgical procedures are in game at least, in like lore-wise, are being performed, and that people are being put in solitary confinement on a regular basis. That this same location in game, it's like it has a chapel there, like, and I think it's interesting that's like, hey, like, shouldn't the if whoever the priest is in this, or sorry, whoever the priest was, or whoever the religious minister would have been theoretically, like, if they really cared about helping people, why weren't they helping the people here? Which is interesting, like, an interesting conversation, how it's like sometimes, like, I guess the word I'm looking for is, like, if someone sees atrocities going on, do they have a duty to try and stop them? And, like, or is it better for them to do what they can without rocking the boat, like, under the pretext that this is the only way that they can help, or the only way they'll be allowed access to help? Oh, and I have the monkey paw this time, but I don't really want to do the monkey paw. Yeah. It's like, how do I put this? I think that there's room for, like, all different types of religions, and that people's religious beliefs are very valuable and beautiful. But I did want to touch on the fact that it's like, hey, maybe there are circumstances where religious leaders should be doing more to help if they see atrocities going on. Yeah. So yeah, I wanted to talk because I do feel like Sunny Meadows is, in a lot of ways, it's therapeutic in that it is a representation of all the atrocities that have happened to disabled people and neurodiverse people, in a society that doesn't always want to acknowledge that these things in some cases are still happening and have happened throughout history. And I think it is a good segue / talking point to address these things. And I do, like, I feel like, on one hand, like, we do need more people who have gone through, like, bad things to be able to speak up and say this is what happened, to raise awareness. And also, like, I like how it's representation in a way that I feel like representation doesn't always occur. So yeah, thank you for listening to me talk about seclusion rooms and Sunny Meadows and some of the atrocities that have happened not only throughout history to the disabled, but also that still have occurred to people like me in the 21st century, like seclusion rooms and restraint and lack of access to bathrooms. So yeah. And, oh, before I forget, yeah, I also, sorry for all the background sound here, but I also wanted to briefly touch on the fact that it's like, okay, I think it's sad that it's like we have this whole building, lots of room, in game. Let me turn the volume down a little bit. Like this whole building in game where it's like there's all this room to theoretically put disabled people in. It's like sad to realize how many people, like, are not part of society, who are denied access to public spaces because they were essentially segregated, separated on something that was out of their control. And I think the world would be a better place if more disabled people throughout history and to this day were living in their homes with wherever their family type unit is, rather than being institutionalized. Like, the public deserves to have deserves to be able to hear our voices. And yeah, I feel like yeah, someone shouldn't be denied equal access to a public space based off of something that's out of their control. So yeah, I thank you for listening to me, I guess, like like talk about like a lot of trauma, work through a lot of trauma, and I hope you have a great day.